In this podcast, Scott Harrison, CHRO at Valparaiso University, talks about the fabric of a learning organization. So stay tuned. So welcome everyone to another episode of Jobs of Future podcast. Today we have with us Scott Harrison, who is a Chief Human Resource Officer at Valparaiso University. A brief bio. So he's an accomplished human resource practitioner, leader, strategic business partner, and change agent. Highly skilled in employee relations, organizational development, interpretation of HR performance metrics, and regulatory compliance. Other key focus areas include total employee wellness, diversity, inclusion, and employee training. And he has a JD in administrative law, labor and employment law from Thomas Cooley Law School, and BA in communications from Michigan State University. And with that said, Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. So I think one thing that fascinated me about your profile, and we talked briefly before this conversation as well, was your background is in employment law, labor law, and administrative law, and your journey to an institution that has a significant role, if not less, in preparing folks who will impact the jobs of future. So if you can walk us through your journey, that will be really, really helpful.
Certainly. I actually began my professional career working as an occupational safety manager in a food processing facility. And that's really where I started to really understand the relationship between people and the work that they do, people and their coworkers or the company that they work for. And I wanted to have a broader scope of influence over that. And so human resources had really been the goal, if you will, at the time that I shortly after I started my professional career. I went to law school the same way a number of my colleagues would have chosen to pursue their MBA. And the thing that I got out of law school was really twofold. Understanding the law helps in understanding the mechanics of working in human resources, but the problem solving or the problem analysis skills that you develop in law school translate very well into a profession that deals with people and relationships. So that's kind of how I launched my maiden voyage into human resources. I returned from law school to my employer in a human resources director position. And of course, the learning didn't stop there. My transition to higher education, the higher education industry, was really one of passionate interest. I'd been exposed to higher education through most of my life. So when an opportunity came up, and ironically that opportunity was with my alma mater, Thomas Cooley Law School, I jumped at the chance to take that position on. And as I got into higher education and learning more of the details and the nuances in higher education, that really prepared me to transition to my current role in a fully in a full university where there were many different subjects, many different departments, and so on.
Interesting. And if you can walk us through your current role, like what does really a chief human resource officer at a university, what are some of the roles that what your day to day look like? That will be really helpful.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, very briefly, I think I describe my work as being involved in all facets of the employment relationships we have with our employees, whether they are professors, whether they are staff members, working in a particular support department, working in a particular business office. So it ranges widely. Now, what goes into those HR or into those employment relationships is influenced by our approach to recruiting, our strategic plan, the objectives of the university, legal compliance with both state, federal law, administrative laws. So those things all influence how we shape the culture. And in fact, one time I did a presentation for a student SHRM group talking about HR as the keeper of the employment culture. And so in a nutshell, that's really what we do, both the tactical and the strategic.
Interesting. I think couldn't have said any better, and I do appreciate sharing your perspective there. So I think one thing that, as I said previously as well, that I'm fascinated about sort of this conversation was primarily the very aspect of your role in an institutions that has a significant role in preparing us for the future of work, right? So if you can walk us through some of the challenges or some of the trends that you are seeing in when you are doing employment, or when you're sort of considering the employment or the workforce planning for something like an institute that prepares this knowledge that help others, what would it look like?
That's a great question, and it could involve a lot of different answers. Let me see if I can kind of narrow it down a little bit. The first challenge I think that we're trying to address is what are the future jobs going to look like? What skills, what thought processes are going to be necessary for students emerging as graduates from our university, and we couple that with the question of how far out do we look? How far out can we plan? The technically speaking, the things that we look at are what types of jobs will there be in the future? How do we incorporate the technology, which is really the driver for what the future of employment looks like? How do we incorporate those things into our educational delivery model? So we're confronted really with two sides of the coin. We're trying to prepare people for jobs of the future, and we're trying to prepare our people today to continue to deliver that type of education or that type of message to the people in the future. It's important to remember that whether we're talking about professors or whether we're talking about support staff, that they too are employees, and their jobs are changing right along with other jobs into the future.
Interesting. And I think when you was describing that, I think one thing that I was thinking about was previously you talked about that as an HR executive, your role is also to sort of preserve the culture of the institution that you represent, and then you get the employment sort of employees in it. So in an educational institution, right? So we are seeing there's a lot of disruption through technology, right? We are seeing online courses, and the universities has been primarily focused on 4 year, 2 year templates, like some of the very traditional cut programs, semester and whatnot, and very culturally inscribed into all the template of how even our learning to a certain degree is influenced with that template. So when you as a bridge between that cultural perspective of a traditional way to learn tackles with your technical aspect of embracing technology in educating, how do you make that balance? If you can walk us through that.
Well, that's a great question, and it sort of presumes that we actually find a balance in that. And I think that's, and I don't mean that to sound cavalier. We're constantly struggling with that. The most immediate thrust is to understand what the not only the needs but the expectations are of our student customers, to put it in business terms. And likewise to anticipate or to figure out how advancing technology can be harnessed or shaped to improve maybe the delivery of the educational programs, maybe to more effectively deliver the educational programs, and I don't know that there's any one answer that any institution is going to settle on. Those are the things that are debated and will be debated into the future. I think the biggest challenge for many institutions, higher ed institutions, is to overcome the traditional concepts or some of the traditional trappings of a university or a college. Those being sort of what I call ivy covered wall images, excuse me, that we continue to perpetuate, when in fact many younger people today, the traditional age students, and I'll speak in a minute about why that or how that is changing, but traditional age students, students who are 18 to 23 years old, who are coming into college or university for the first time, they don't have that concept, because as you correctly point out, there are institutions out there that provide online learning. Online learning is becoming an essential component in almost any higher education institution, and technology is advancing other things, other delivery mechanisms that many professors today, those who are mid-career or later career, had no appreciation of when they started. And so they struggle sometimes to figure out where and how we introduce these technologies into the classroom. So I don't have a really concise or really short answer that summarizes that. Those are debates that continue to go on in the universities.
Interesting. So, and thank you so much for walking us through that. The other perspective I think about when I draw a parallel from, say, an education institution with a big conglomerate that is preparing their workforce to this latest trend and ensuring that I think so. Whatever university does to a society to keep them ahead in what's going to happen. If we draw a parallel to, say, a company like IBM or GE, like ginormous companies who have this university focus as well, like who wants to make sure that their employees are at the top of their game, or who are sort of, they understand that the change in the trends. What are some of the learnings that you think they could learn from in educational institutions in drawing, sort of in ensuring that their workers are always at the best of the game?
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, that's a great question, and I don't think it's so much about what those institutions, those organizations, whether we're talking about a General Motors, or any other large organization. I don't think it's so much about what they can learn as it is about how they can help shape the future of their employees. One of the things that has been tested, and there's a lot of literature out right now, and a fair number of champions of skills training and teaching people trades and things like that. There have been a number of instances where business has partnered with colleges and universities to help formulate actual programs. And there's a trade-off that the employer has a certain level of investment in it, but also makes certain assurances about the numbers of people that they can hire or take from that program. We saw that in some test cases in North Carolina, where companies were actually partnering with community colleges, and we've seen it. In truth, we've seen it for a long time. Large corporations partnering through grants, through other research contributions with major universities, but driving it down to all colleges and all universities, I think is one way that that all businesses will in the future benefit from the graduates who are coming out of whatever institution you're talking about.
Interesting. I think so. You're raising a very critical point, and I think, and I do appreciate you jumping on this. So I think one of the thing that I as an entrepreneur, I have my own company that I run, and I find a problem with sort of when I talk to a university or a local university in Boston. So if I want a talent, right, I want it now. Maybe in next 7 days, maybe in next 20 days or whatever, right? And I want them to be trained, right? And I don't have a setup to educate and empower these workers, right? I don't have a setup to, even if I talk to a lot of executives at bigger companies, they share the same concerns. But then when I talk to institutions, I think I remember one of my recent conversation, I was talking to one local university here in Boston, and they said, hey, um, we can launch a course, a 6 months course that probably will get some people sort of in this particular template. I was telling them, hey, I hope you say that, okay, because you guys are the maestro in educating people. You understand the education business. You understand what all techniques and technologies needs to work together to educate and empower a worker. But now businesses has to take upon themselves to educate, and businesses are lousy when it comes to education. They're not in the business of educating, right? They're in the business of executing. So from your vantage point, what's your perspective, number one, on that, and number two, do you see it happen are happening in future where university will be closely aligned with even companies in delivering them work or sort of prepared workers in some degrees?
Absolutely. Let me back up just a little bit in your analysis. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that most companies struggle with training and developing their employees. That's not what they're in business for one thing. By and large. At the same time, there are some very successful examples of companies who do educate their employees, corporate universities that educate their employees not only on processes that are important to those particular their particular organization, but even more general processes. You look at Walt Disney World and the Walt Disney Institute, which can teach about concepts that translate across industries. McDonald's Corporation and Hamburger U, people who have gone through those processes. That the general sense is gone through those educational programs. The general sense is yes, they're going to be the most outstanding McDonald's employees and managers and supervisors that are out there, and they will stay with the organization for potentially their entire career. But those that don't can still use those skills as a bona fide for their ability to manage in other types of organizations or other types of companies. It very much depends on who the companies are or where they want to translate those skills or transfer those skills. But nonetheless, those are examples of organizations that have some outstanding internal training programs. And I do think that companies need to make assessments about what things they uniquely need to train their employees on. There's always going to be a component of training with any employee coming into an organization for the first time. The question is, how much of it will they need? How specific does the training need to be, and so on. But moving further into your analysis, yes, I absolutely believe that we are going to see a growth in partnerships between colleges, universities, and private business to prepare future employees or prepare students to be future employees in those organizations.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Interesting. And now let's talk about how you, as an HR executive for an institute, your work has changed when it comes to, say, previously considering how the education is changing, right? So there was a generational perspective in education. What are some of the things that you see, or some of the trends that you are seeing in education, and the requirement of the talent to educate this sort of new trend and phenomena? What are some of the changes that you are seeing that you can walk us through?
Well, fortunately, um, uh, I think when we bring in um, employees who are just starting in their careers,
Mm.
they bring a lot of a lot of the knowledge that we want them to have. They bring it with them. Um, uh, I think the biggest focus that we have is in most cases is less on education. We want to certainly see education in a field relative to the what the employee is being hired to do.
Mm.
But we look equally uh, at experience, particularly in the non-professorial
Mm.
roles. Um, what have they learned? And where have they learned um, some of the relationship skills
Mm.
that are necessary? If they don't have the technical skills, we'll ferret that out fairly quickly. But um, but having the relationship skills, understanding the role that they are seeking to undertake in the organization, and where it fits and how it fits within the organization. Can they talk intelligently about how that role will contribute to the institution, to the university, and are they familiar with newer technologies? Um, are they are they willing to um, are they willing to be change agents?
Mm.
Really, um, we
Interesting.
don't want to hire people, and I think organizations occasionally see this, and they sort of accommodate for it, and that's the idea that an employee who starts out in a particular role 20 years ago,
Mm.
they get comfortable with it, and they get to a point where they don't want that role to change, or they're not willing to change that
Mm.
role, and so they sort of stagnate, and organizations, I think, have to be very mindful that we can't allow employees to clog the path to progress
Mm.
by being unwilling to change, or by um, not embracing change as a natural part of employment.
Interesting. I think so. That's a very, very interesting thought. And I think before the interview, we were talking about your perspective on generational sort of getting generational perspective to figure out business sort of uh, how the generational perspective is critical for maintaining or sustaining the business's future. So if you can walk us through that thought, that would be amazing.
Well, yeah, I think that is probably the one of the most challenging and I think previously overlooked areas in business. We're starting to see more and more consideration of this, but um, oftentimes it is presented in seminars or in workshops as um, thinking about the 3 or 4 generations that make up the workforce today. The and what are the differences in their understandings. But what we don't really talk about are ways to overcome those differences, or the need to overcome those differences. And by overcome, I mean we have to collate those differences in order for the organization to continue to move forward. We tend to think of and in many cases this is true, the hiring manager is probably of a generation ahead of the employee or the candidate who is applying for the job now. And when we look at some of the characteristics that go along with generational differences, for example, we like to engage with people or hire people or work with people who look like us, who think like us, who sound like us, who have shared interests, who sort of reflect back ourselves in themselves. And and that's something that we need to that's something that we need to be on guard for against. And that's not to say that one generation needs to surrender its ethics or its business opinions based on what another generation thinks, but they have to be open to the idea that their ethics or their processes, their opinions will be challenged, and they have to be open to the idea that they could be changed to a more modified position, because we can't. And it works that way regardless of whether the hiring manager is a generation ahead or a generation behind the person who's applying for the job or the person who is reporting to them in a traditional organizational structure, because that leads to stagnation. If you're absolutely unwilling to change, if you haven't accepted that the future is inevitable, whatever the future is inevitable, because time is going to march on. Then if you haven't accepted that, then an organization is going to stagnate. And one of the things that gets the most the strangest looks from people is not when you tell a more senior generation, hey, you have to be open to the ideas of younger employees. It's that the strangest looks come from the younger employees when I remind them, you're going to be obsolete at some point in time as well. And many of them, it was a very interesting. It was very interesting to watch Mark Zuckerberg testify before the congressional committee, because just to give an idea of how fast time flies and how the future is in the next moment. When you consider that in 2004 he was 20 years old when he launched Facebook, and everybody hailed him as a child prodigy, and rightly so. But today he's 32 years old. He's a billionaire. He has 2 kids, and he's testifying before a congressional committee of people who are 1, 2, or 3 generations ahead of him.
True.
And so we can look at the dynamics, look at how he testified, what were the concerns of the people who were on the panel, and do generations that are coming up behind him, do they have those same concerns? Where has his perspective shifted as he has gotten more mature and more experienced? And when we look at things like that, and we can translate that into our individual businesses, when we start really taking those things into consideration, then I think we can start addressing the loggerheads that we come to between generations.
Interesting. No, I think, by the way, beautiful point. And I think so. One thing that I was thinking about, your emphasis on relationship, right? So when I talk to, say, other HR executives, and in fact when I talk to other universities who I'm sort of affiliated with in some ways, I had this constant sort of conversation or discussion about them is about the online and offline, and their emphasis was, hey Vishal, doing an offline course would give these guys a kind of a relationship building movement that would be missing when it comes to online courses. Sure, they'll get their content delivered to them. Sure, it'll be exciting, if it'll be more exciting than an offline template. But what would be missing is their appreciation of diversity in that room, their appreciation of interpretation of the same content in 17 different ways, delivered to 17 students in the same class, and their interpretation. And understanding that there are sort of those, you have to be inclusive in those conversation. And that was that sort of brought that aha moment for me, that yes, when technology is making things really convenient for us, it's actually taking us away from the very aspect that made us relevant to begin with. So as an HR executive, like how do you sort of balance that out, or how do you restore that particular aspect of you said generational perspective, or you also said about sort of inclusion of thoughts and ideas. What are some of your thoughts of fixing this?
Well, I don't know that it necessarily can or needs to be fixed. It is the way that the future is going. But let me say this: the more that we create from a purely HR perspective, from a purely employment relationship perspective, the more we can provide self-help mechanisms or service mechanisms, I think we learn and adapt to different perspectives and different ideologies as they relate to the employment relationship. The fact is, I don't know how we back up the clock to a time when interpersonal relationships are the norm, or where we get where we can reacquire the value of those interpersonal relationships. About the only way we can do it is to reinforce our own beliefs that those things are important, and demand that if somebody wants a particular experience, that we demand, if somebody needs a particular experience, that they experience it through our organization. So we maybe there are classes that we do not offer as online classes, for example. If that direct human contact, if we value that, then we have to be able to force it onto people, because the current cultural direction is more and more online, and with good reason, and there are many values that valuable things that come out of that. Technology has significantly shrunk the world, and as it shrinks the world, we need to understand we have more and more interdependence on each other. At the same time, I think it begs the question: what are we placing our interdependence on? Are we placing it on the online presence, or are we placing it in the person who is represented by the online presence? It's a very challenging thing.
Interesting. Wow. So interesting. So I think one thing that let's talk about. We're on a technology. So let's stick to for that for a few more minutes. So you talked about sort of the technology impact in our day-to-day work functioning and in our ability to function as workers. So now let's talk about work-life balance. That's something as an HR executive that's in your advantage also, to ensure that the workers, they remain sort of they maintain a healthy work-life balance so they can deliver a maximum outcome, they remain happy and all that. So now, tell us, how is advancing technology impacting the work-life balance from your vantage point, and what are some of the ways that you could, or what's your thought on that?
Well, I think we have to. I think technology has shifted the paradigm of work-life balance. Traditionally, when we talked about work-life balance, when it was really sort of an emerging idea, it was at a time when you would get up, you'd go to work, you'd drive to work, you'd work your shift, whatever hours were necessary to work. You'd leave work, drive home, eat dinner, watch some television, and if you wanted to spend more time than that with your family, you would go on vacation. The question was disengaging from the burdens of work in order to focus on other things that were important in your life. Well, technology has changed that entire paradigm, and it's been changing it for some years now, so that there is a blend. It's hard to tell in some cases whether or not somebody is working or somebody is taking care of personal business. I encourage employers to factor those things in as a means of making or generating a more productive workforce, as opposed to somebody taking 3 or 4 hours off from work in order to attend a doctor's appointment, or to conduct banking, or to get a prescription. If the technology is available for them to get online and do their banking, or do even some social things for a few minutes during what would traditionally be called their break period or something like that, then let them do that. That keeps them in the workplace. or it makes them immediately available when they get that concluded. It makes them immediately available to pick right up where they left off, and the workflow continues. Now that's just one example, but what has become the norm today, I think, in most organizations, is that somebody will be carrying their little smartphone with them. And so it doesn't matter if I am attending a Tiger ball game on a Saturday afternoon, or I am traveling on vacation in Europe. I can conduct business simultaneous with the pleasure, and likewise, I can simultaneously conduct pleasure or personal business at the same time that I'm sitting in the office. So we've really lost the clear distinction between what time is work time and what time is personal time, and we're disengaging from work in short bursts, interwoven with short bursts of time being engaged with work.
Interesting.
Now that doesn't apply obviously to all jobs in all industries, but we are seeing more and more and more of that.
Interesting. So, good point.
And the further technology advances, we will see that more and more, even in industries that or areas that cannot right now sustain that. Manufacturing, for example, we will achieve a time where people will get on their smartphones and or some other device and be able to program the robot at their workstation to perform some work.
Interesting. So, great. So on that, on sort of how the impact of technology and it's impacting how we work and function today, I definitely want your perspective on an interesting thought. So, and the thought is, does HR owns the employability of its workers? So if suppose right now we know technology is changing rapidly, everything's going under disruption, right? So if I get employed in a company and very soon I became obsolete. So who should be? So does HR ensures that I as an employee remain employable whether I'm working or not? So what's your perspective on that?
Well, the first thing that I would say is it depends on what aspect of you is becoming obsolete. We will. My hope is that we will always have a need for knowledge workers, and that knowledge workers will be the jobs of the future. In other words, they will what they will bring to the table is an understanding of some things that technology cannot substitute for. Assessing quality, assessing changing dynamics in the marketplace. Assessing the momentary changes that are necessary in output, for example. So to the extent we don't make the human mind obsolete, there is no question but what the physical work will increasingly be reduced.
Interesting. And so we're almost at the tail end of the conversation. So I want to spend some time on your position, and then and personally you. So let's talk about being a CHRO in an education institute. So, from your vantage point, what are some of the tenets or some of the successful tenet that is helpful for us HR leader when it comes to running either a U of a big corporation or an educational institute?
I think regardless of the type of organization that you're working with, you have to develop both an understanding and a perspective that looks at the organization holistically. That it's not just a bunch of components that have been thrown together or a bunch of people that have been thrown together, but they are all interrelated. I think it's extremely important to be an active listener, and to open yourself up to new ideas and new perspectives, as well as questions and challenges to the way things are being done, or the way things are working, and all that. It really can be summarized as, I think one of the most important characteristics is that you don't want to be the smartest person in the room, even if you are the smartest person in the room.
Interesting.
You want to learn from people, even if what they're telling you is maybe not exactly the right perspective or the right idea or the right road to go down, because there's something that is inspiring that thought. And so I've tried to be those things, and tried to cultivate those characteristics in myself.
Interesting. So and so one more thing that I want a perspective on your role is your ability, or your ability to respond to innovation, right? So HR is a role that's very closely tagged with the culture, preserve and protect the culture of an institution or an organization, and from there on bring that and then use technology to empower the future, or sort of create sort of better horizon for the company. So that means when you say preserve and protect the culture and you talk about innovation, they're like two sort of not very not on the same coin many times. So how, as you as a leader, would perceive innovation? Like, what are some of the ways you sort of either embrace it, or what some of your thoughts or hacks that you use to recruit innovation?
Well, let me first say that and if I characterized it this way, I didn't mean to. I believe that HR is a keeper of the employment culture, not necessarily a preserver of the
Interesting.
employment culture. And by that, I really mean that we want to keep a culture that looks forward to, or at least embraces, the inevitable changes that the future will bring. And whether we're talking about being a higher ed institution, where it is important that a component of our education is to prepare people for those future changes, or whether in my role as an HR leader, to identify people who have that vision of the future is inevitable, and me as an employee, I am going to embrace that future and do my darndest to contribute to that future. I think that's what my role is to identify people, and sometimes to educate those people. Certainly the employees who are part of the culture before I may help to make the selection, or even after helping make the selection, to educate them that their success is dependent on their willingness to meet the future and meet it head on.
Interesting. Well said. So let's talk about you. So in your journey so far, if I would say, what are, say, some of the tenets of your success so far? Like, what are some of the things that you really hold dear onto, and that has helped you be successful in your journey? If you can share some insights on that.
I think I think very much like I said before, it is a willingness to see the big picture, to understand the organization holistically. I think it is to never lose sight of the fact that my objective, or the objective of my department, is to work with people. And at the end of any work process, project, whatever, it's about the people and the relationships that they have with each other.
Interesting.
That defines the success of the organization. I also recognize my own limitations, the limitations of my knowledge, or the limitations of my experience, and try to never lose the opportunity to learn from somebody who does have those experiences or does have insights on a particular issue. So I think that the key to success, and I would say that that's true for most people. The key to being successful is to understand that you can't be it all, and you don't have the final say.
Interesting. So one more thing we ask all of our guest speaker is about their favorite read, any particular book that they recommend our listeners and viewers. Do you have any recommendation that you want to share with us?
One of my favorite books, and I refer to it fairly often, is called Lincoln on Leadership by Donald Phillips. What's interesting about that is that in Lincoln's time, I think you first of all begin to understand that problems are problems, no matter what generation those problems are occurring. Some problems are just bigger than others. Running a country in the middle of a civil war is usually a bigger problem than which tie do I wear today. But what's really interesting about that is that Lincoln himself recognized that the value and importance of relationships, and his role in those relationships, in developing those relationships, in cultivating them, and in some cases in exploiting those relationships. Extremely important concepts if you read between the lines of that book.
Interesting. Interesting. So, with that, we're at the end of the conversation. And Scott, thank you so much for being so candid and so open with your time, and walking us through your journey, walking us through some of the interesting perspectives of creating a learning organization, what all it takes, and what are sort of the fabric of that. Before we part ways, I certainly want your closing remark for our listeners and viewers who are listening to this conversation. What would they take away from whatever they have heard so far?
To all of you out there, the future is a big, dark, sometimes scary room. Don't make me go in there alone. That's what I would leave you with.
Nice. That's intense. So, beautiful. With that, Scott, thank you so much for your time. You're always welcome back on the podcast to share your journey. Wish you nothing but success in your role, and we would be looking forward to some interesting work from your end as well. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Vishal. This has been a tremendous pleasure, and I wish to you and all of the participants in your site the same thing. Much success and courage as you move forward.
Thank you.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a